Boiled macaroni on a hook. That's it. That's the whole trick. Plain pasta, cooked firm, threaded onto a small hook. And for generations, Amish fishing communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, were pulling fish out of creeks and ponds with it, while their neighbors drove to bait shops and spent money they didn't have to spend. In 1987, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission quietly flagged something they called non-commercial bait materials being used in that region. The memo was shelved, never acted on. And the reason it existed at all is the part that should make you angry. Stay with me, because here is what that memo was really about. It wasn't about conservation. It wasn't about fish populations or water quality or invasive species. It was written because people were catching fish without buying anything. And somewhere, that was a problem for someone. Let's start with what this actually is. You take standard elbow macaroni, the kind in the blue box at the back of every pantry in America, and you boil it until it's just firm enough to hold on a hook. Not mushy, firm. You thread it through the center on a small hook, size 6 or 8, and you drop it near the bottom in still or slow-moving water. Carp absolutely cannot resist it. Catfish hit it reliably. Panfish come in numbers. In the right conditions, trout will take it too. The method costs almost nothing. It requires no tackle box full of synthetic attractants, no gel bait, no artificially scented power bait in a jar with a neon label. Nothing. Just pasta. And it works better than most people would believe until they've tried it. This is where the skeptics tune out. That's fine. But here is the part they always miss. Cooked starch doesn't just sit on the bottom of the water. It disperses. It sends out a slow, cloudy plume, soluble particles that spread downstream and outward from the hook, mimicking exactly the kind of organic breakdown signal that tells bottom-feeding fish something edible is nearby. Fish don't find food with their eyes. They find it the way a hound finds a trail, through dissolved chemical signals in the water. A Penn State Extension Fisheries note from 1974 described this mechanism directly in the context of grain-based attractants, noting that starch particle dispersion in still water produces a feeding signal radius far wider than the bait itself. The fish aren't seeing the macaroni, they're following the signal home. That's the mechanism. It isn't magic, it's biology. Simple, observable, and completely free. Now here's the part that makes this more than just a clever trick. This wasn't invented by anyone. It was known. It was ordinary. Across the 19th century and well into the 20th, rural American fishing culture ran entirely on what you could pull from the kitchen or the field. The 1891 Ohio Farmer Almanac, a widely distributed agricultural publication of its era, carried an entry specifically addressing bait pastes for carp and bottom fish, listing boiled grain, cornmeal dough, and bread paste as standard effective methods, not as curiosities, as standard methods. The almanac didn't explain them as if they were unusual. It mentioned them the way it mentioned planting schedules and fence repair, as things any sensible working person already understood. This knowledge wasn't fringe. It wasn't folk superstition. It was functional community information passed from one generation to the next because it worked and it cost nothing. So when did it disappear? Not slowly, not naturally. The timeline is specific, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. By the early 1950s, commercial bait and tackle manufacturers were consolidating. Chemical companies were entering the fishing market with synthetic scent formulas. By 1975, power bait and engineered attractants dominated retail shelves in virtually every sporting goods store in the country. Mainstream fishing publications, the magazines your grandfather might have kept in a stack by the door, had almost completely stopped mentioning natural starch methods. Not because those methods stopped working. Because the advertising revenue came from companies selling the alternative. Write that down somewhere. The methods didn't fail. They were crowded out. Here is the number that makes this concrete. The current annual U.S. fishing bait and tackle market is worth approximately $4.2 billion. $4.2 billion. That is the size of the industry that replaced a box of pasta and a handful of grain. Not because the new products are categorically better, because someone figured out how to make you need them. And now here is the detail that should make every fisherman watching this sit up straight. Between 1988 and 1994, 3 states quietly added language to their fishing regulations that hadn't been there before. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Minnesota each incorporated some version of a non-manufactured bait materials clause, vague language that, depending on how it was read, could be interpreted to restrict the use of homemade or kitchen-sourced bait in certain waters. Enforcement was inconsistent. The language was never loudly announced. Most anglers never knew it existed. But remember that 1987 Pennsylvania memo, the one that flagged non-commercial bait practices in Lancaster County, the one that was shelved without formal action. That memo was written 1 year before Pennsylvania added its non-manufactured bait language. 1 year before. That is not a coincidence. That is a sequence. Because the memo didn't come from a concerned biologist, it came from a complaint. And the complaint didn't come from an environmentalist. It came from bait distributors. The bait distributors were losing sales. That was the origin of the whole thing. Not a conservation concern, not a threat to fish populations, not a single data point about ecological impact. Regional commercial bait sellers had noticed that a specific community, the Amish fishing communities, simply wasn't buying from them. And they wanted to know why. When they found out, they wanted something done about it. That is the engine behind the 1987 memo. That is what set the regulatory machinery in motion. But to understand why it worked, why a complaint from bait distributors could actually produce state-level regulatory language, you have to go back further. You have to see how the foundation was already being laid, quietly, for decades before that memo was ever written. Here is a detail that gets almost no attention. Before World War II, competitive fishing culture in the American Midwest and Mid-Atlantic treated homemade bait as entirely legitimate, not tolerated, legitimate. The 1938 Indiana State Fair Fishing Division kept an official entry category listed simply as paste bait. Competitors entered with their own prepared grain and starch mixtures, judged on results the same as any other method. It was a recognized discipline, not a loophole, a category. By 1961, that category was gone from the entry list. Something changed in those 23 years. The post-war consumer economy rebuilt itself around manufactured products replacing made things. The fishing industry was no exception. Bait went from something you prepared to something you purchased. And the cultural shift happened gradually enough that most people didn't notice they'd crossed a line, from producer to consumer, from maker to buyer. And the industry that benefited from that shift had every incentive to make sure the line stayed crossed. This is where the American Sport Fishing Association enters the picture. The ASA is a real organization. It represents manufacturers, distributors, and retailers across the fishing products industry. It lobbies. That is part of its stated function. And in the 1970s and 1980s, as the commercial bait market was reaching full dominance, the ASA and related industry groups were actively engaged with state fish and game commissions on what they called bait standardization. The framing was regulatory tidiness. The practical effect was something else entirely. A 1983 internal document from within that standardization process, referenced in later State Commission correspondence, used language that is worth sitting with. It described homemade and non-commercial bait materials as a market integrity concern, not a safety concern, not an environmental concern, a market integrity concern. The argument, stated plainly, was that unregulated bait materials created unfair competition for licensed commercial bait providers. Let that land. The method your great-grandfather used without a second thought, the cornmeal paste, the boiled grain, the kitchen-sourced attractant, was being reframed as a threat to market integrity. The commons was being enclosed, and the regulatory language that followed, the non-manufactured bait clauses in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Minnesota, was the fence going up. Now here is the payoff the memo has been waiting to deliver. Go back to that 1987 Pennsylvania document. The full picture of what it actually said is this: the flagging of non-commercial bait practices in Lancaster County was triggered not by any observation from a fish warden, not by any ecological study, not by any complaint from the fishing public. It was triggered by a formal inquiry submitted by regional bait distributors who cited lost sales volume in specific zip codes that corresponded to Amish settlement areas. The memo's language, and this is the part that matters, explicitly referenced competitive bait market disruption as the basis for review. Not fish population data, not water quality, not public safety, competitive bait market disruption. The Amish were catching fish with pasta and cooked grain. They were not buying commercial bait, and someone with a financial stake in that purchase decision found a way to make it a regulatory matter. Here is the good news, and there is real good news here. That regulatory effort largely failed. The non-manufactured bait clauses that appeared in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Minnesota in the late 1980s and early 1990s were either removed in subsequent regulatory cycles or narrowed to apply only to specific competitive tournament contexts. In most states today, plain boiled macaroni on a hook is fully legal for recreational fishing. Starch paste is not listed as a restricted bait material in current Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Minnesota recreational fishing regulations. The language that was meant to make this method marginal didn't hold. Check your own state's current regulations before you go out. That is always the right move, because local rules vary, and tournament fishing has its own separate standards. But for the ordinary angler fishing a local creek, a farm pond, a reservoir, this method is available to you right now, this week, tonight, if the weather holds. And here is what makes the full circle almost insulting. The commercial fishing bait industry didn't abandon the starch dispersion principle. They kept it. They just repackaged it. By the 1990s, high-end prepared baits built entirely around soluble starch and protein dispersion, the exact same mechanism the Amish were using for free, were appearing on retail shelves at premium price points. The science that was too simple to monetize when it lived in a kitchen became very monetizable once it lived in a branded container with a patent attached. They didn't bury the method because it didn't work. They buried the free version so they could sell you the expensive one. That is the complete arc. Ordinary household knowledge, documented in almanacs, practiced by rural communities, recognized in competition, used every day by people who simply needed to eat, quietly pushed to the margins by regulatory language, drafted in response to commercial complaints, while the underlying biology was absorbed into a premium product line, generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue. Think about the man on the creek in Lancaster County with his bucket of cooked macaroni, no receipt, no synthetic gel, no neon label. Just a method that worked because the biology was always there, waiting for anyone willing to pay attention. You are the type of person paying attention. That is why you are still here. If you have ever caught fish on homemade or natural bait, pasta, bread, cornmeal, anything your grandmother would have recognized, drop it in the comments. That record matters. Every story down there is proof that this knowledge never fully disappeared, no matter how hard certain people tried to make it inconvenient.